Hey, what's up everybody? I'm Tommy, and today I want to tell you about this miniature table saw sled that I have built. So it's a lot like a normal table saw sled, except that it's much smaller. I'm really happy with how this thing turned out. I used a piece of oak here on the bottom so that it would be more stable and it would sit inside the slot nicely. It'd be more precise, and unfortunately I actually cut the piece of oak a little too small. I kept trimming and trimming and trimming, and I over trimmed it. So I put a piece of tape on this side, and this tape measures 4 thousandths in thickness. And when I tried to put a piece of tape on the other side, it would no longer install into this slot. So now the amount of play this thing has is somewhere between 1 and 4 thousandths, which I think is pretty good. I was a little bit worried that the tape was gonna make it bind in the slot, but that hasn't been the case at all. It's been fine. And every now and then I wax the bottom of the sled and the tabletop and the tape as well, and everything has been working just really great. And so now I'm just gonna do a test cut and show you how it works. So as you can see, it slides just fine in the slot, and it makes really nice and square cuts. Now, if you were to look at this over, maybe 2 or 3 feet, then maybe you would start to detect some out of squareness in this cut. But for my purposes, the sorts of things I normally cut, I mean, this is incredibly square, and this is going to make just perfect joints. Usually the longest boards I would be cutting on this sled, or the widest boards I would be cutting on this sled, would be about 6 inches, because my joiner has a 6-inch limit. But anyway, in this video, I'm just gonna show you how I went about building this thing. So I squared up the piece of oak by taking it to the joiner, squaring a face and an edge, and then taking it to the planer. Then I started working on the MDF. So this is just a laminated piece of MDF, and I worked at, number 1, squaring it up, and number 2, getting it down to the approximate size that I was going to need for the sled. I didn't want to get it down to the tiniest size just yet, because I wanted to make sure I didn't make it too small. So I just got it close. Then I took a piece of Douglas fir and started trimming it down to the approximate size I wanted for the fence. After I had it down to the approximate size, I headed over to the joiner and the planer to make sure it was squared up. I measured the depth of the slot on my table saw and then planed the oak down until it was the right size. I planed it down until it was slightly smaller than the depth of the slot. I didn't actually want it to hit bottom. I took the piece that was to be the fence and measured out the approximate length that I wanted for the fence. I just wanted to make sure I didn't get any knots included in there. Then I squared it up on the miter saw. I checked the depth of the fence and decided that it was taller than I was ever going to need it to be. So I made my marks and then trimmed that down on the table saw. After that, I just kind of put everything loosely together to get a feel for it. Then I moved back to working on the piece of oak and trimming it down to the correct width for the slot. This is where I kind of went overboard, and I trimmed it just a little too much. But I had already used up pretty much the entire piece of oak in the planing and jointing process, so I had to work with what I had. When I thought it was fitting pretty good, I decided to put a little bit of wax on it to see if that would help it slide more smoothly, and it did a fine job. I then picked the most consistent portion of the piece of oak to use as the actual rail. I determined where I wanted the rail to be and made some marks and started going about setting that in place. The easiest solution I found was just to clamp my speed square in place and use that to butt the rail up against it. And that seemed to work pretty well. After I had everything clamped up, I drilled some pilot holes and of course counter bores to make sure that the heads were sunken below the surface of the rail. I drove the screws by hand because I didn't want to risk overdriving them and either splitting the piece of oak or having the screw poke through the top side of the sled. Once I had the rail attached, I tried it in the slot and it started feeling like the sled was still a little too big, so I made some adjustments and trimmed it down to size. Then I trimmed the sled so that it had a zero clearance with the blade itself. I wasn't quite sure how I was going to make sure that the fence was 100% square to the blade. Then I got the idea to clamp my speed square to the blade itself. Once I clamped it up and squared the fence itself up to the speed square and pulled the sled back to meet it, it actually met perfectly flush. So it felt like there was no adjustment that was going to need to be made, meaning I could just make sure that the fence was completely flush with the back side of the table saw sled, and it should be 100% square. So that's what I did. I just clamped everything up and kept checking and checking and checking to make sure that the fence of the table saw sled was completely flush with the back of the table saw sled. And again, I just kept tweaking it until I made sure that it was perfect, and then I clamped everything in place and drove a couple screws just to hold the fence there. I thought it was possible that I might have to come back and adjust the fence, where in which I could just remove one of the screws and then move it if necessary. But as you'll see later in the video, that wasn't needed at all. After the fence was attached, I just trimmed it so that it also had a zero clearance with the blade. Then I put a coat of wax on everything that made contact with anything else. It really started moving nicely then. That was pretty much it for the sled. At that point, I just started doing different types of test cuts to see what I could pull off with it and see how accurate it was. And as it turned out, I didn't really need to adjust the fence at all. I was getting really nice and square cuts in that initial orientation. And the final test was to use the sled to do a tenon to fit a mortise, just to see if I could. I was able to pull it off, but it wasn't perfect. I think the limiting factor in this situation though is my table saw itself, because it doesn't have a blade depth lock, and that affected the tenon, but overall it worked out okay. So again, I'm really happy with how this thing turned out. It's really small, easily managed. I can hide it away quickly, store it away quickly, and it's just worked out great. It's not perfect, but it does a really good job for the minimal amount of time I've put into creating it. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe. Until next time, I hope you have fun building something.